Why did the Axis not build four-engine bombers? This is a question that we will answer in this video. And who is we? That is going to be Justin Pike and myself. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about the Germans, whereas the previous one has already tackled the Japanese. Big thank you here, of course, to all the patrons and channel members who make this possible. And as supporters, you also have early access to all videos, including them being ad-free.
This video is sponsored by the free video game War Thunder, a game that makes your air power fantasy come to life.
As with the previous episodes, we focus on aircraft that are serious contenders, at least to a degree, or aircraft that were pressed into military service and were fielded in some number, rather than just paper planes or projects that never really got through a functioning prototype stage. It is also not going to be a what-if discussion, but rather it will be an evaluation of why both countries, in this video's case, Germany, made very conscious choices about not investing, or when they did, investing into long-range heavy bombers and what those were. So let's get right into it.
To lead you into it, for the quick upfront answer, why didn't Germany build four-engine bombers?
So the quick answer to that is they, of course, did. But what they realized is when they wanted to build a coherent force about four-engine bombers and have multiple geschwaders, so that is wings or groups, depending if you're American or British, that it was, in fact, a very bad idea for Germany to have that until it is the de facto uncontested hegemon in Central Europe. And it's at that point that they wanted to swing over and potentially invest in that sort of capability. And I think what we really have to contend with that is sort of the geopolitical outlook that Germany has in the 1930s and where it aims to take its military campaigns and how to shape the European continent in its favor before it does any sort of investment.
Sure. So if you want to, I guess, walk through, like, how are they envisioning four-engine bombers and their place or not having a place in their concept of air power?
Yeah. So one of the books that I like to go back to is one that was written in 1937. It wasn't actually written by a German. It was written by a Brit, Norman Macmillan. And this is a book that gets actually quite quoted in a very important book on the German Luftwaffe, written by Karl-Heinz Völker in 1967. And it's this book, The Chosen Instrument. And this is one of those classical 1930s books where somebody sits down and sort of envisions the air war of the future. And the important quote there is from Norman Macmillan, open quote, "Germany is like a boxer in the middle of the European ring. She can hit out in all directions from a geographical center," end quote. That's really a good way to describe the geopolitical situation of Germany, of being able to lash out in all directions. But of course, if you're able to lash out in all directions and hit something, all directions can also turn around and hit you. And the Germans very quickly, of course, they know this. And as they look at the future projection for an air war, as soon as the Nazi party is in power, they start getting a bit more hands-on with the actual planning. So in 1933, so this is very much at the start, the Nazis haven't even consolidated their power just yet. But Robert Knaus, who is an air power theorist, some people may call him the German Do He, he circulates a pamphlet in not the Luftwaffe officially yet, but what will eventually become the Luftwaffe. And he calls for a bomber fleet of 200 long-range bombers that have a combat radius of about 500 to 800 kilometers and have 2,000 kilograms of bombs. And he believes that this is the best way for Germany to ensure that no other country is going to attack it. So it's basically the threat of the disproportionate costs over the potential gains of attacking Germany. And this very much plays into what the Luftwaffe will also do over the years that follow out of this, namely that they keep on using the Luftwaffe and the threat of the Luftwaffe in their propaganda campaigns and also on the geopolitical level. So there's a meeting between Hitler and Sir John Simon, who's the Foreign Secretary of the UK in 1935, where Hitler basically says, look, the Luftwaffe is already on par with the RAF. We're going to get even stronger very soon. and you should not attack us. Now, at this point in time, in 1935, that's complete nonsense. Germany has about 2,500 aircraft at this point, but only 800 of them are actually frontline aircraft, and all of them are completely out of date compared to their UK counterparts. But it shows you sort of that power projection element and where air war fits in the geopolitical thinking of the time. And then when we go to the military, in 1934 and 1945, we have Walter Wever, who becomes the later chief of staff of the Luftwaffe, the first chief of staff of the Luftwaffe when it's unveiled in 1945. And he does what every German general of the time likes to do, and ever since the time of Prussia and Clausewitz, and that is he conducts a Kriegsspiel. So that's a war game, right? And he postulates that it's likely that Germany has to wage a defensive war versus France at this time, because France might take the initiative and have a preemptive strike against Germany. And in this war game, he says the Luftwaffe has to go on the offensive, and they play this out. And what the Luftwaffe in this war game does, it first tries to gain air superiority over the front lines. It then tries to push back the French air bases that are close to the front lines, then have aircraft support the ground maneuver of the German army, which is now at ease to maneuver because the enemy air power on the front line has been eliminated. And the Luftwaffe then moves on to hit the airfield, the aircraft factories further away. And this latter part plays in directly into sort of the strategic bombing. And if any of our audience has actually looked at the episode that I did on Luftwaffe doctrine, the foundations are set right here, 1934, 1935, for exactly that. And arguably they go even further in time from that. But for Germany, what it really needs at this point is modern bombers to carry out exactly this assignment. And in 1934, 1945, during these the war games, what they basically assume is that they're going to have an 80% loss rate on all their bombers, because at this point, as I said, Germany is completely on the back foot when it comes to technology and designs. It's still operating Junkers Ju-52s as basically their stand-in bombers because they don't have a proper bomber design. And they really have to start pushing to get those modern designs into the factory and into the force.
The can of worms of aircraft, I'm wondering if you can maybe walk through some of the at least the early attempts at different bomber designs for Germany.
With Walter Wever, then come the first two aircraft that I think we should talk about, and that is the Dornier Do 19, as well as the Junkers Ju-89. And they were afforded the highest priority in the rearmament program of the Luftwaffe. And it was assumed at the time, so this is sort of the early mid-1930s, that a selection between these designs would take place in 1936, and that there would be a large-scale production by 1938, which would mean that by 1939, 1940, those bombers would be in the force. At least a couple of Geschwaders of them would be available, right? Now, there's a couple of more concepts that Germany plays around with this time when it comes to the bomber, the Kampfzerstörer, which is sort of a blend with a heavy fighter or bomber, but we don't have to really concern ourselves with that for now. The interesting aspect is about the Dorniers 19 and the Junkers 89 is that the sources on these aircraft vary a bit, and they don't actually give us extensive details on the technical aspects of these aircrafts. However, generally, the Dornier is considered the weaker contender between the two. And I think this is also, well, on a technical level, this is probably represented in somewhat, but I think it's also that nowadays we make that assumption simply based on the fact that the Ju-89 goes on into becoming a semi-successful design later on with the Ju-90 and the Ju-290, but I'll maybe talk about that later on a bit. But basically, technical specifications for these aircraft is a one-way range of about 1,600 kilometers is typically cited, and they should probably have had a internal bomb load of up to 1,600 kilograms as well. Although I wasn't actually able to find exact details on how the bomb load would affect the range characteristic in this particular design. The Ju-89 also starts to allegedly achieves 2 record-breaking flights, reaching 9,300 meters in altitude with a useful load of 5,000 kilograms, and 7,250 meters with a useful load of 10,000 kilograms. Now, it's important to realize useful load is not bomb load. It includes things like crew, fuel, weapons, so defensive armament, and ammunition for it. But it gives you sort of an idea of, a bit of something to these designs. But both were received quite mixed in the Luftwaffe. I personally sort of get the sense that everybody who looked at these designs kind of wanted them, or wanted a heavy bomber generally speaking, but that in this particular instance, the designs just weren't good enough. And that also other elements, and quite frankly, reality, so technical knowledge in Germany on engine designs, industrial capacity, and so on, really held them back from saying, yes, we will actually adopt one of these designs. You can quite clearly see this with, for example, the director of the technical office, Oberst Wimmer, who is, when he's first in 1935, sees sort of the prototype of the Ju-89 in the Dessau factory of Junkers. He's kind of lukewarm to it. He's like, yeah, we kind of asked for something like this, but doesn't seem to be shaping up all that well. Blomberg, who is at this point the Minister of Defense in early 1935, later on he becomes the War Minister, just because the Ministry of Defense in Germany is changes its name to Ministry of War. He supports the 4-engine bomber when he sees the Dornier 19, but he also doesn't make a executive decision of saying, yes, we should absolutely put this aircraft into production. And then Goering himself doesn't seem to be all that happy with the program. It's never really explained why Goering doesn't like it. Based on what I glean from the sources, I'm sort of theorizing that it's a mix of Goering at this point feeling left out of the decision-making. It's very much based around Blomberg, Wimmer, and Wever, of course. So maybe that's why he didn't really like it. And also because maybe Goering understands, quite frankly, that the resources that it takes to build even a single of these aircraft will heavily impact the capacity of the German industry to build anything else. The reception to these aircraft, the Dornier 19 and the Ju-89, really isn't that good.
Do you want to go into maybe some of the industrial factors behind some of these the difficulties the Germans are facing?
Yes, Justin, I will. But first, let's get into the beautiful air power land of War Thunder, where industrial factors, resources, and maintenance do not matter. This game is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices. It features over 2,500 vehicles, and a lot of them are aircraft, including some of the planes we talked about in this mini-series. The Japanese G5N and G8N from last time, and the Heinkel 177, the Focke-Wulf 200, and the Me-264 coming up in this episode. You can also take command of tanks and ships. I'm not sure why you would when you have planes, but I don't kink shame. Choose from 10 major nations and an arsenal including biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. Put yourself right into the center of the action in War Thunder, where incredible detailed vehicles, realistic graphics, and authentic sound effects suck you into an immersive gaming experience. Check it out for free, and even better, get yourself a bonus pack if you follow the link and sign up. Or, as a returning player, sign in with that link after not having played for 6 months on PC and console. The bonus pack includes an exclusive vehicle decorator, in-game currency, and a 7-day premium account, giving you the best start into the action.
Do you want to go into maybe some of the industrial factors behind some of these the difficulties the Germans are facing?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to really explain nowadays how difficult rearmament was for Germany in the 1930s, because we have this sort of picture of this highly industrialized force, this extremely modern force. So there's always this image of German technical know-how is at the top level. But in the 1930s, because of the various treaties and accords that follow from the First World War, and this is not just the Treaty of Versailles, mind you, there's a couple of other treaties in the 1920s as well that curtail what Germany is allowed to do and not allowed to do in the air domain, mean that it has an extremely weak engine industry. Now, on the theoretical side, it has scientists and has engineers that really know what they're doing. But even though the restrictions of what Germany is allowed to do watered down over time, it is not allowed for a very long time to build high performance engines en masse for military purposes. So there is a clear lack of capacity in Germany to build engines, to also have a skilled labor force that can put these machines together and manufacture engines within the required tolerances. And it also has a very limited number of functional designs, because industry, of course, wasn't going to invest into engine development if they knew at the time that they weren't allowed to do it, or they didn't have the political backing to do it, or couldn't sell the designs that they were coming up with because there was no air force to sell to. So initially, when the Bramo and the Daimler-Benz 600 engines were put on the Dornier 19 and the Junkers equivalent, it really results in very disappointing performance, with, as I said, neither bomber having really the speed or the range of the bomb load that is required. But beyond that, one of the things that always gets talked about this long-range bomber debate is, of course, Walter Wever and the effect that his death has on the actual program. Although I think that in itself is also quite overstated in some points. When Walter Wever dies in 1936, he dies, by the way, in an aircraft crash with a Heinkel 70. He doesn't do a proper pre-flight check. He takes off. Apparently, one of the control locks was still in place on the aileron, and he crashes. And Albert Kesselring takes over as chief of staff until 1938 from his position. And Albert Kesselring is somebody who specifically is known to not like the heavy bomber concept. And it's this incident that most people cite as the reason why the Ural bomber project was cancelled. However, we know that Walter Wever himself acknowledged that the Dornier 19, the Ju-89, and the whole project in itself was unlikely going to be successful. And he recognized that Germany did not have the capacity to build these resource-intensive and technologically dependent four-engine bombers. So in April 1936, 2 months before Walter Wever dies, Oberst Wimmer at the time draws up completely new specifications requiring new designs and new prototypes for a future four-engine bomber. The Dornier 19 and the Ju-89 basically die at this very point. Wever is still alive, and he signs off on this. He is the chief of staff after all. And that's why I genuinely believe that this constant finger pointing to this being person's death being the reason why Germany didn't have a four-engine bomber at the start of the war is really quite reductive in the analysis. The termination of the project, while it is officially happening in 1937, nothing really happens with the program after the new specifications have been issued. There is still some remaining work on the Ju-89. It sort of gets subsumed in the Ju-90 project, which was running at the same time, which was basically a civilian long-range passenger aircraft that then gets moved into the Ju-290, which becomes this maritime patrol aircraft. But we don't have to really address that anymore because it wasn't a bomber. And but to conclude here, the reason why the Germans make this decision and Wever makes this decision really is summed up quite clearly by the historian Edward Homze, who said, open quote, "Why commit a disproportionate amount of scarce materials and factory capacity to build a big bomber that would be hopelessly outdated by the time it could be issued in operational units?" End quote. So the result of this is that the heavy bomber development in Germany is not stopped by principle, but it waits until Germany and German industry is ready. And this is what also the historian James Coram tells us in, open quote, "It became the priority of the Luftwaffe air staff to simply skip the first generation development of bombers and begin research and development of a future heavy bomber, which would be deployed when the German aircraft engine industry and aircrew training had caught up technologically." End quote. And this is, of course, where we start seeing sort of the next specter on the horizon. And I'll again quote here from another historian, Klaus Meyer, who said, open quote, "Although the search for a powerful four-engine combat aircraft was not abandoned in principle, Heinkel was commissioned to develop the Heinkel 177. The German aerospace industry was henceforth committed to the production of medium bombers." End quote.
So I guess tied into this as well is military planning. So as we know, technology doesn't just spring out of a hole in the ground just for the sake of it. It is supposed to be a solution to problems that an organization has envisioned. So of course, the obvious question is, well, you're in the middle of Europe and you could potentially be fighting a war against the Soviet Union, which is very large, and they could move their factories far into the interior. You've got Britain, of course, and then even more ambitious, you have potentially the United States. How's the Luftwaffe thinking about these potential future opponents?
So the easy answer would be to say they don't think about this. And that is very reductive, but sort of to break that open a bit and to talk about it in detail. In the mid-1930s, the Luftwaffe does not yet actively prepare for a war against Britain, the Soviet Union, or America. That doesn't mean that they didn't assume that eventually this would take place. Absolutely. They were absolutely clear that war would eventually happen, preferably with Germany starting that war from their own planning, because it provides them with the element of surprise. We see the effect of that, for example, during Operation Barbarossa, where the Luftwaffe and the German army are basically able to almost completely wipe out the Soviet Air Force. But for now, in the mid-1930s and the opening stages of what Germany would do and how it would shape the European continent amongst its neighboring countries, basically the assumption was Britain, the Soviet Union, America, they will stay neutral for now. A lot of political maneuvering is to make sure that this happens. Italy has to be brought on side. Germany does a lot to disrupt sort of relations between Poland and France. And it does a lot of propaganda aimed directly at Britain, and also a lot of political maneuvering, of course, with Britain. So Germany knows that for a certain amount of time, by trying to keep these immediate, large, looming threats away from itself and keep them still at the threat horizon, it has to pick its fights very carefully, and it must ensure that it is not attacked from those multiple directions. So it plans for short campaigns. Take Austria of the Anschluss, knock out Czechoslovakia, then take Poland, and finally take France. Perhaps also do something on the northern flank with Denmark, Norway. And then think about, okay, we will, once we've established that hegemon on the European continent, think about the next step, which would be a war with Britain or a war with the Soviet Union. And because they do so, and because they have some success in actually achieving this goal, I mean, until Germany invades Poland, it gets away with, frankly, way too much. It builds up a force that is specifically geared to support such short campaigns. So you have the Ju-88, you have the Heinkel 111, you have the Dornier 17. And that builds up a very large force. And that goes, of course, with Goering's requirement to the Luftwaffe. That is summed up by one of those famous quotes from him. Open quote, "The Führer does not ask me what bombers we have, but how many," end quote. That goes into the force architecture of preparing for those short campaigns, of massing firepower on the front lines, and within limited campaigns against certain one-off opponents. But it also goes into deterrence, because the more bombers you have, the more you can turn around to Britain and say, hang on, we've got a lot of bombers. You really don't want to attack us at this stage. Just let us, do our thing on the European continent and we'll get to you. Basically, that was the German strategy. They wanted to construct this force very consciously, deliberately build up that military foundation to set the continental hegemon, and then have the next step for the global war. And Volker sums this up quite nicely when he says in his book, open quote, "The early program to build up and expand the Luftwaffe can only be understood if neither an air war against the United Kingdom nor a military conflict with the Soviet Union was considered," end quote. Of course, considered at the time in the mid-1930s. A war against the UK and a war against the Soviet Union was planned, but not just yet. And we also see this reflected again in June 1937, when there's a guideline that is issued to the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, and it says, open quote, "A conflict with England was a special case with an extremely unfavorable prognosis. It could worsen our military situation to an unbearable degree, to the point of hopelessness, end quote. So you can see there, by the end of the 1930s, the Germans were quite clearly saying, we need to keep this war with what they call England. This is just a German thing. It's the United Kingdom or Great Britain. We need to keep this away from us as long as possible, because they anticipate that they need to be ready for this battle sometime 1941, sometime 1942. And it's actually towards the end of 1938 that the Germans start to realize this, and Hitler starts to understand that Britain will not stay neutral as envisioned for some time. And again, Volker says here, open quote, the envisioned pattern of the conflict changed in the second half of 1938, when it appeared that the Western powers may intervene. Until that point, a war over the Atlantic or an attack on England had neither been prepared, nor did Germany establish the material foundations for such an operation, end quote. And it's at this point that there's a sense of urgency that starts building up in Germany, but there is still some time. At least they consider that they still have some time. And they assume, the Luftwaffe assumes, that an operation against what it calls England, what is the United Kingdom, Great Britain, would ideally start around 1942 after an attack on France, or if Britain stays neutral after an attack on France, in an opening surprise strike against Britain itself. And for that plan, in November 1938, it finally makes the decision to say, yes, we need long-range bombers, and it wants to grow a force of 58 Kampfgeschwader, and 30 of those were to be reserved against the fight against the United Kingdom and France, which is a nominal force of about 2,800 bombers. And at least 4 of these Geschwaders are meant to be Heinkel 177s. That's just under 400 aircraft. And we know now that plan was not realistic at the time, but it's at this point in time, in the end of 1938, that for 1942, Germany plans to get ready for this sort of battle.
So I guess I'm gonna checkmate you here. So you're talking about how the Germans don't have 4-engine bombers, but what about the Focke-Wulf 200?
Yes, the Focke-Wulf 200. So
just end the video right here.
Yeah, we can checkmate. You can drop your mic with your fancy new headset, and I'm done. I assume that the comment section may already have outpaced you on that one, but yeah. So I have a long episode on the Focke-Wulf 200 already. So let me just sort of give a summary at this point. The Focke-Wulf 200 is, unlike some of the other designs that the Germans have, not a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is a 100% civilian aircraft designed for civilian purposes, mainly passenger and maybe some cargo mail flights. That's it. It is moved into the Luftwaffe service in late 1939 as part of Erste Gruppe Kampfgeschwader 40, which eventually goes on after Germany takes over France. It eventually becomes Fliegerführer Atlantic for the anti-shipping campaign against the Atlantic convoys going towards Britain. However, this aircraft, very early on in its career, shows clear signs that it is not up for military service. There are early mining operations with Erste Gruppe Kampfgeschwader 40 during the Norway campaign, and the commanding officer of the Gruppe at this point actually calls the Luftwaffe's high command, and in the phone call he says it is, quote, nonsense. In German he used the word unsinnig, to use this aircraft as a military machine. It's just simply not built for it. But the Germans have at this point no comparable machine that has comparable range to make these sort of long range trips into the Atlantic. So it is kept into service to attack merchant shipping. Actually, initially it's meant to spot merchant shipping, send out a signal towards the U-boats, and lure them in towards where the convoy or the individual ships have been spotted. And for this, of course, you need loiter time. Yeah, you fly to the search area, these vast distances over the Atlantic. You need to get into the areas where the ships and the convoys are operating in, and then you need to fly a search pattern there, and then you have to come back. So that's you need a lot of loiter time. You need endurance for an aircraft. So yes, the Focke-Wulf 200 had some of that. However, it turns out that an aircraft is a lot faster than a U-boat, which is a big shocker. So instead of just spotting the ships, the transporters, and telling the U-boats where they are, it became more usual that U-boats would tell where the ships are, and then a Focke-Wulf 200 would be sent out and would arrive in the area where the ships or the convoys were spotted and would then be able to engage. And it did so at the start fairly well. But there's three things that are really hampering it. The Allies start introducing AA guns on their ships, and that causes a lot of problems for the Focke-Wulf 200 crews, which were initially coming in at very low levels and being able to, bomb defenseless merchant shipping. That's no longer the case. So they have to go to higher altitudes where being hit by AA is less likely, which reduces their accuracy considerably. The second issue is that this aircraft has very poor serviceability and maintenance characteristics. And there is also, and this comes out of sort of this design for the civilian market, I think it's an assumption at this point. It can't really be proven for reasons I will go into just in a second. But it's assumed that a lot of Focke-Wulf 200s are lost to catastrophic structural failures rather than enemy fire, because they are pushed into flight maneuvers that they were not designed for. And if you think about sort of a Focke-Wulf 200 coming in at a shallow dive against a ship, dropping its bombs, maybe there's return fire, so it starts pulling maneuvers. It's going through, a flight envelope that it wasn't designed for. And there are, rumors enough that quite a few of these aircraft just simply fail structurally. And because this happened over open water, and because maybe they also sunk the ship that they attacked, and there were no witnesses, neither from the crew that was saved from the plane nor the ship, it's an assumption for now. But it gives you sort of an idea of what this aircraft was probably going through, what it was not designed for. So, is it checkmate? No, but it of course is an aircraft that was pressed into service and provides one of those exceptions, maybe you could say, to the rule.
So I guess the other one that you've already mentioned before, and I've at least heard of, I'm not super well versed on a lot of German aircraft, I will admit, but I have heard of the Heinkel 177. So what is this thing, other than something I see vaguely off in the distance when I play War Thunder sometimes?
Or this picks off exactly where we stopped early on with the Dornier 19 and the Ju 89. Because there is this sort of tacit understanding between Heinkel, the Luftwaffe, and the Air Ministry that Heinkel will design the future long-range bomber for the Luftwaffe. Now, this project starts generating some speed in 1937. In March 1938, the development is briefly stopped. It is then resumed. And when the first prototype flies in November 1939, this is when it is basically immediately pushed into production. Now, that production drive is then throttled again from, I believe it's about 20 machines or 25 machines that were supposed to be built a month to 5 a month. But what's basically happening here is that the aircraft goes into production before there is any time to fix the many issues that it has. And it's also before all of the specifications and requirements that are leveled to this aircraft are officially signed off and set in stone. They keep changing what they want this aircraft to do. So after the Battle of Britain then, mid-1940, the aircraft is sort of in pre-series production. It gains new importance because the Luftwaffe says, well, we are in a war with United Kingdom now. We need a bomber that has range. We need a bomber that has a lot of bombs at useful ranges. So, the 177, it needs to come in now and quickly. It has still competing design requirements. So it's meant to do dive bombing or rather glide bombing, but that's really only a secondary issue. The main issue is again on the technological side. It's the engine and the cooling arrangement of that twin engine arrangement. Basically, it's a DB610, which is two DB605s. Just so it's two. It looks like it's a two-engine machine, but it's actually a four-engine machine. And that is the main issue. That is also why it gets its nickname of the Flying Lighter. I'm not actually sure if that's a nickname that originates from the time or if that's a more recent invention. But basically, it was known to spontaneously start burning because the cooling arrangement and the way it was routed, and then leaks started heating up on the actual engine and started combusting. Bad stuff happened. And once an aircraft is on fire, it's on fire. And even if you have a fire extinguisher, that generally doesn't help you too much. As an aside here, end of 1943, the Germans actually recognized that the DB610 is never going to work in the way they wanted, and they want to change the Heinkel 177 to a four-engine design, conventional four-engine design. Never gets anywhere. Now, my sense is that even though the Germans start to accelerate the production of the 177 because of all the issues that it has, it basically passes its time of worthwhile introduction into the force. The Germans aren't able to build up a sufficiently large force to launch a new bomber offensive versus the United Kingdom within an environment where that is permissible. So go from a sort of a fighter interceptor to air defense perspective, because the Germans would only able to field maybe 20, 30, 40 bombers of the Heinkel 177, and that's not enough to wage a bombing offensive against another country, which is a lesson that the RAF and the United States Air Force Army Air Force also learned. So in March 1943, there is the threat of a cancellation. So the 177 is basically on the way out. And then the Kriegsmarine goes, hang on. We need a plane like this because the Focke-Wulf 200 can't do what we wanted to do. The Junkers 290 is a maritime patrol aircraft. What we need is an aircraft that can do some reasonable accuracy with glide bombing and sink a lot of ship in our anti-shipping campaign in the Atlantic. And while Hitler and Dönitz have multiple meetings on this, there was one specific chat in February 1943 where Hitler once again is quite pessimistic towards Dönitz and says, this aircraft will probably not be ready, and if we do get it ready, then it's not actually going to be all that good. That doesn't stop it. Also on demands from the Navy, the Kriegsmarine, to have the Luftwaffe basically being ordered to create 5 Geschwader. So this is quick math, 420, 440 aircraft nominally that would support the Navy. And this order goes out in June 1943, right? As a reminder, this is 1 year after the Luftwaffe was supposed to already have 4 Geschwader of the Heinkel 177. It basically, at this point, barely has a Gruppe. The first Gruppe really only starts to get put in place by the end of 1943. I think the first operational sorties are in December of that year. While you could now say, okay, so the Germans did have a long-range bomber, I think simply because of the limited impact it had, and also the fact that less than half of the 1,150 that were built actually get formally accepted by the Luftwaffe, you do not have an aircraft that warrants sort of the label of being a frontline aircraft for the Luftwaffe in any particular strength. And Boog, I think the reasons for that are quite interesting as well. And if I sort of look back to the industrial standpoint of what could be potentially built instead of these Heinkel 177s, Boog makes a very good argument by saying, open quote, the full extent of this mismanagement of aircraft production is evident from the fact that with the amount of raw materials required, 10 to 15 times more Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters could have been built and in terms of labor expenditure, 6 times more, end quote.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, it puts it into perspective, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's also an argument that I made with the Zerstörer, with the Bf-110. Like, a Zerstörer was 2.5 times the price of a single Bf-109. So that sort of starts, you can sort of see where the resources are going and how you really have to be careful with your force architecture, so you don't lock yourself in one track and then suddenly you're missing fighters, or you're missing bombers, or you're missing whatever.
Yeah. So I guess we will now address what a lot of people have probably been eagerly anticipating, and that is the menace that is the Amerikabomber. Although I guess it was a menace, it's just maybe not to what people think.
Yeah, menace to the bureaucracy, probably. I mean, yes. So the Messerschmitt Me 264 is probably the aircraft that is mostly in line with the so-called Amerikabomber project. Just like the Eurobomber project, it has a fancy name that creates all sort of illusions. But let's stay with the facts here. The Messerschmitt Me 264 is initially carried, sort of designed by Messerschmitt's own initiative. But there is interest that emerges in the Luftwaffe around 1941 for this project, at which I think 6 prototypes are ordered. The actual Amerikabomber project was only launched in 1942, when the German Air Ministry put out that request for a long-range bomber that could strike the United States. There's various designs that are linked to this: the Focke-Wulf TAR 400. You have the Junkers Ju 390, which would have been an extension of that Ju 290, which I already talked about. And of course, also the Heinkel He 277, which would have been an extension of the 177. But it's the 264, the Messerschmitt design, that is really most connected to that program, because it has really the paper qualities that the Luftwaffe was looking for, and because it was the only realistic option that went into some sort of prototyping. It's really interesting. So I had a previous episode on this aircraft, and in that one, thanks to Dr. Klaus Schmieder, who wrote a book that also touched upon this subject, and basically Hitler's fatal miscalculation of declaring war on the US, which of course this bomber is part of that story. Even though it is a project that is running in the Luftwaffe, it's never seriously prioritized, because realistically speaking, while it sounds good for the Germans, I guess, to have this long-range bomber that can fly over the Atlantic and drop a couple of bombs on New York, there is really no cost-benefit value to the Germans at this point in time. And one of the letters that Dr. Klaus Schmieder found in his research was actually from Claude Dornier, who we of course know from the Dornier company, and I'll just quote him here from my previous episode. Open quote: a 1942 letter from Claude Dornier, whose company was briefly under consideration to take over the project, basically reminded a fellow production manager that the original idea behind the Messerschmitt 264 was a blend of propaganda and deterrence. So what this aircraft is basically meant to do, it is to fly over to the US and either drop leaflets or drop bombs in order to say, hey, America, we can strike you, you better surrender now. That is sort of the functional idea behind that. But does that really have a cost benefit to the Germans? And this is where I'm going to pick up that industrial argument again of what could you actually build or man or staff or sustain throughout a war, right? So a German Kampfgeschwader nominally has a strength of about 93 aircraft, right? And in terms of crew, we are talking about around 340 aircrews, depends on exactly which aircraft is in the Geschwader, and 320 support personnel, again, plus minus in the margins. If we were to compare that, let's say, to the closest equivalent of what the Me 264 would have had, which is the B-29, the American project, a long-range bomber, you have a very heavy bombardment group, which has about 45 aircraft, nominally speaking, and 2,000 personnel that go with that. So if we now move back towards the Germans and say, okay, so let's take the B-29 support infrastructure and the amount of aircraft, or like staff to aircraft, as a guideline, basically 50 Me-262 would require the same investment of 2 full Kampfgeschwader of medium bombers. So basically half a Geschwader of Me-262 would require the resources of 2 full Kampfgeschwaders of HE-111s, Dornier 217s, Ju-88s, you name it, right? So Germany basically has to give up 200 medium bombers, fully well knowing that that the Luftwaffe basically needs these bombers on all different frontages that it has. And what it gains for that is 50 Me-264s. And I don't think that makes sense. And I suppose we can make the same argument here with the fuel consumption, right? So if a single Me-262, by rule of thumb, to have the fuel that this single aircraft would be able to fly at its most extreme range and then come back, is basically the same fuel amount than 6 Heinkel 111s at a half fuel load, which allows them to have a operational penetration depth of 200 and 300 kilometers, which is exactly what the Luftwaffe was looking for at the time in its campaign.
I guess another question that we can get into here is, how are they basing them to actually reach the United States? As people have already watched my video where I bring up problem of, like, the very obvious problem, if you stop and think for a second, of basing. Yep. So how is Germany gonna do that?
Yeah. This is always an interesting discussion, I think, because maybe you've observed this as well. There's quite a reductive element to this on discussions that I see, at least on the internet sometimes, not in all quarters, but in some, where there's a very critical issue of like, how do you base your force and how do you sustain it, is completely left by the roadside, right? It's almost like the internet assumes that fuel supply, ammunition, facilities, and the crews that make all of this happen just magically appear out of the ground just as the aircraft is leaving the factory, and then everybody sort of scurries off and does the job, right? It's obviously not so, and I believe most of our audience intrinsically understands this. But the basing issue is a really interesting one with the Me-262. With the Me-262 as well, but also with the Me-264, because there's basically 3 theories out there about how this could have happened. Either the Luftwaffe would have used the Canary Islands, or it uses the Azores, or it uses France, right? So let's go through those in turn. The Azores are under control of Portugal. Although Portugal was sort of right-wing leaning, it never threw its hat in the ring with the Axis. And in fact, it progressively starts more and more drifting towards the Allied quarter. And in 1943, Portugal actually agrees to provide access on the Azores to the Allies. So I'm just going to ignore this option, because there's also no sort of credible primary source that I know of that the Azores were ever really discussed in Luftwaffe. This seems to be sort of a theory that comes out later somewhere. Then you have, of course, the Canaries, right? And that would have been also quite a complex issue, because what you would have to do is these are controlled by Spain. So yes, you have theoretically some good relations with the Spanish, because Franco, fascist leader as well, but not normally formally on the side of the Axis at all. So you have to convince him to take a more active stance and become de facto part of the Axis, which is already a steep gamble. Then you would have to invest a lot of resources to get the island or one of the islands in the Canaries ready for the Me-264. And how many of these 264s can you even base there, right? I mean, if you've ever flown to those islands, I haven't. I've just looked at them from a satellite imagery. I mean, there's not that much space to build up a massive airport with basing, a whole Geschwader on there of 90 aircraft. That's pretty tough, especially at the time. So you have to build and extend the existing airfields and the existing support infrastructure. You then need to guarantee an absolute constant stream of supplies, either by sea or air, with a lot of precious fuel being sent to this remote place, and you're burning fuel while you're bringing it in there. So for every liter of fuel you're bringing, or for every gallon of fuel you're bringing in there, you're probably burning 2 or 3 gallons. I could probably give you a more exact measurement if I actually did the calculation. You have to build up sea and air defenses against Allied, against Allied attacks, whether it's air attacks or.
I was trying not to burst out laughing, like thinking of the Kriegsmarine trying to stop the Royal Navy and the US Navy from just obliterating it.
Right? It's just like a small raiding force can already do massive damage, but like just the Royal Navy only has to show up, or like maybe even the Americans show up and do a drive-by with a carrier. I mean, the Royal Navy will probably already do it before that. So it's farcical that this is considered as a realistic option. And if you also look at where the Canaries are, in 1943, Gibraltar is right there-ish, right? North Africa is basically squarely in the hands of the Allies. The Kriegsmarine is completely bottled in. The Germans are losing their bases in Italy. And fair enough, you can say, well, if the Azores don't work, if the Canaries don't work, let's just base them in France. Okay, so my hypothesis here is that if even 4 Me-264s were to be based somewhere in France, let's say Brest or something, where they have the closest connection to the American mainland, they fly over and they drop so much as a single leaflet and fly back, that the reaction of the 8th Air Force that is stationed in the United Kingdom would be to comprehensively obliterate this airfield. Like they would throw every single aircraft against it just to make a point. So yeah, it makes absolutely no sense in my mind. I haven't seen any sort of source or any sort of argument that suggests to me that it was realistic that the Germans would ever have the ability to use the Me-264 against the United States. And it's not just me, it's Klaus Schmieder, of course, who says the same thing. Open quote, I have not been able to find a shred of evidence that suggests that a serious bombing campaign involving the Messerschmitt 264 was at any point contemplated, even in passing. End quote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. So I guess in the end, where does this leave us? How would you like to sum up kind of Germany's 4-engine bomber adventures?
Oh, yes, putting this all into a comprehensive conclusion. Let's see. I mean, I think there is a clear understanding in Germany at the time that, yes, bombers are absolutely key in any upcoming conflict. They are the means that allows an air force to put firepower on the ground, right? But the development of these bombers was very heavily influenced in the early period by basically 3 aspects. First, the disadvantage in terms of engine technology that had to be really rapidly made up and curtailed a lot of the early development. Secondly, then sort of this economic and industrial basis that still had to be built up and was in many ways built up very rapidly with the accompanying sort of training of skilled labor. But all of that would still always be at a capacity and resource disadvantage to what we would see with Britain and the United States later on. And third, that initial period that we have in the war years also actually didn't require Germany to have a heavy bomber. But it clearly mismanaged sort of the later introduction of one by having been far too optimistic in its geopolitical gamble and also the sort of the projection of where the conflict and how it is going and how it's going to play out. If you look at sort of Heinkel 177, for example, considering that the first prototype flew in 1939, it is actually feasible in my mind that this aircraft could have seen service in small numbers in 1941. If the initial idea of skipping that first generation of heavy bombers had not then also been halted and then suddenly accelerated while the specifications are changed and so on and so forth. And that would have made the Heinkel 177 a contemporary of the Avro Lancaster, the Halifax, and so on. However, I would also say, like, if we look at sort of the way that Germany had to fight its war, that just from a pure path dependency standpoint, a heavy bomber program is far more tempting for countries like Britain and the US. Because they know they have the resources. Britain can, use the Commonwealth for that. The US is just the US. They have every single resource that they need, and if the few that they don't have, they can acquire somehow. But also because sort of their geographical location meant that they had to field long-range bombers, and that the Air Force had to make an argument for these aircraft in particular. And both countries, especially the US, can really draw on industrial capacities and research R&D and resources that far eclipse what Germany could do. And this had an attack effect in pure numbers. But then also, again, especially compared with the US, Germany was far less willing, and this is a fascinating subject maybe that we could discuss in a future episode as well, but Germany is far less willing to synthesize real standardization programs of what aircraft they want and what sort of technologies they want to push out of a very wide R&D portfolio. The US has, an amazing R&D portfolio, but they're very good at standardizing certain programs and understanding and putting their, wallet where their sort of mouth is. Whereas the Germans sort of want to do everything at all times and can't really put a focal point on specific elements. And that's why they also produce way more aircraft than they, not in terms of pure number, but variants than they should have. But maybe as the final conclusion here is that the lack of 4-engine bombers is not the reason I believe that Germany lost or that the Luftwaffe failed. I often find that such arguments are quite devoid of context, and they also fail to recognize that just because one country won with a certain strategy or a certain piece of technology, like the Allies with heavy bombers being one part of the puzzle, it doesn't mean that every single piece of that puzzle was superior, or that adopting that would have worked for another nation, the defeated nation, which quite frankly typically has a completely different reality to contend with. The Luftwaffe had to prepare for a completely different war to the RAF and the United States Army Air Force. And it's in a completely different situation and position. It has a variety of threats and dilemmas it has to contend with that are completely different from those that the Allies are contending with. So the initial choice made by the Luftwaffe to focus on medium bombers was quite deliberate and conscious in the requirements of a continental clash between itself and its neighbors. But it's really sort of that political and strategic blunder that happens time and time again on the German side, and also the increasing dogmatic decision making that are way more influential in Germany's downfall than the lack of a strategic bomber force.
Well put.
Well, thank you, Justin. That brings us to the end.
Now we're out.
Now we're out.
Get out. Yes. Why are you still watching?
Oh my God. This was an hour. It was meant to be 30 minutes. It's an hour. Okay. So I hope all of you enjoyed that, of course. It was a lot to condense into a few things. And I think it picks up really well from where we actually left off with the discussion on Japan as well. So if you have any sort of feedback, any sort of criticism, or you want to push back on individual points, I think you can put those in the comments. We would be very interested in seeing those. Any final words, Justin?
Nope. I have no idea.
You need to get yourself a started sentence. Like,
Bye.
Bye. All right. As always, big thank you to all the patrons and channel supporters, and of course to Justin for hosting this conversation. And I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky. Justin?
Bye.
Make sure you also follow the link in the description to check out the free game War Thunder, where you can teach other players the true meaning of air power.